having access to the internet is a privilege. We know that the strongest threat is the one from the inside, so the insider threat.
What's the fundamental difference in mindset between responding to attacks versus engineering an organization that can withstand them?
Fundamental difference is in the methodologies we use to implement things. For you to consider yourself resilient, you need to really implement something a bit more strategic. In fact, there's a number of approaches you may take. One is a threat-driven type of approach to becoming resilient. Then you got the traditional disaster recovery way of being prepared. In fact, in resiliency, there are 4 goals that are anticipate, withstand, recover, and evolve. And then there are 8 objectives, 14 techniques, and 44 approaches.
If you could wave a magic wand and have every CISO implement one capability tomorrow to improve their resilience posture, what would it be?
Obviously, it needs to be something related to resilience, and and I would definitely say cyber recovery, isolated recovery, data vaulting, and to do it properly, to do it well. So not just following some buzzword from some of the vendors out there, but really do it, choose the vendor carefully, and then implement something that follows best practice standards and proven methods that work.
So, our previous guest asked you, what excites you about the future of cybersecurity and what gives you hope?
There's 2 things I would say. The first one is
Hi, Francesco. Welcome to Be Fearless podcast.
hello, hi Aleksandra.
Yeah, I'd love to introduce you to our guests because we're about to have a very exciting conversation. So, our guest today spent his career ensuring that enterprises can not only survive cyber attacks, but continue operating through them. Francesco is the CEO and chief researcher at High Value Target, a boutique cybersecurity company, the mind behind ISSA Cyber Resilience Special Interest Group, with nearly 2,500 members worldwide, and head of cyber resilience at major pharma company. Francesca, great to have you on the show. You've built an impressive career spanning companies like Symantec, PepsiCo, Standard Chartered Bank, and many more companies. What drew you to cybersecurity in the first place, and how did you become focused on resilience specifically?
Pleasure to be here. Hello, everyone. I think what brought me in was actually, as many of us start at the very beginning, we don't forecast to be experts in a given field, right? So a few years ago, I actually was lucky to meet some great managers along my path. And it started casually. I'm obviously after engineering studies, but I did not know for sure I was going to go into cybersecurity. And I started my journey at a technology provider at the time, Symantec, which is a path that I would recommend to many out there to start from technology vendors because you learn a lot. And then from there on, I was pretty lucky to meet some amazing people that brought me into their teams, organizations, and then gave me, the trust to then build massive programs for these global brands. How did I get into resilience? That actually was a funny situation because it was around 2019. I was at one of these major manufacturing companies at the time, and I got a call from my boss, who got a call from the CISO, and it was, well, there's this thing called cyber resilience now. I'm just off some calls with some. It was like some major government related organizations, and NIST published the cyber resilience guidelines. It was 800/160. It was published just the version 2 in 2019. And so we were one of the first companies to probably adopt that guideline and then implementing it with the help of some integrators. And since then, I just started digging and researching as much as I could until now, and I still didn't stop. I feel like almost I don't know enough, never enough, and and it's a continuously evolving field nowadays.
Yeah, it's definitely a big field, and I realized that today many organizations conflate incident response and resilience. What's the fundamental difference in mindset between responding to attacks versus engineering an organization that can withstand them?
Fundamental difference is in the methodologies we use to implement things. And there's a lot said about how to operate a security operations team, how to perform hunting, investigations, and anything that is in the blue team side of the world. There are guidelines. Again, NIST offers 861, recently updated, and it often starts from investigating, containing, then eradicating, and so on. But these are steps that are still seen as tactical. For resilience, for you to consider yourself resilient, you need to really implement something a bit more strategic. Many people have cyber resilience programs in place, but very few know actually what it entails to become really truly resilient. And that is a coordination of much more than incident response. In fact, there's a number of approaches you may take. One is a threat driven type of approach to becoming resilient. And in there, you got cyber threat intelligence, you got anything to do with preparedness from a threat perspective. Then you got the traditional disaster recovery way of being prepared. Um, you got the response-driven way, and then you got as well some, system-driven, system testing, and anything to do with engineering. Cyber resilience is like the composition of all of these four type of approaches, and so response is just one of them. In fact, in resiliency, there are four goals that are anticipate, withstand, recover, and evolve. And then there are 8 objectives, 14 techniques, and 44 approaches. Again, very few companies out there know what it takes to take this comprehensive approach, and therefore they just fall back on some of the approaches, individual ones that they know about. Oh, let's invest in response, and oh, this is maybe you will see terms like incident response resilience,
Hmm.
or or data resilience, and so on. Well, they are valid terms if you then are able to explain exactly what's behind, but that's not the level of maturity I see out there.
Hmm. So, what in this situation would you advise organizations that, let's say, would have very skewed view of what resilience actually entails?
First of all, well, there's a lot of materials out there that can be studied. That's, for example, how I started. And it
Hmm.
took me a long time to actually um, arrive to a point where the concepts that are available are practical. Um,
Hmm.
Even if you think about NIST 160, which is the equivalent of ISO 15288, which is found with very little applicability, maybe just in some sectors like military or space. But all of these techniques are available, and then can be applied. So what can you do to apply them? Well, as part of the ISSA global community, that's exactly our goal. We do it for free for the community. And an example of these initiatives is the cyberresiliencemanifesto.org. You can go there and you find there a lot of concepts, a lot of readily available tools that you can apply. Um, um, you can as well, though, start from setting the accountability for cyber resilience in the first place, because until it's something that the CISO does, but nobody really is accountable for because it entails so many capabilities, so many teams, then you may know what needs to be done, but then it will not get done because of lack of this, ultimate responsibility. But I think we may get into the skills and the accountability later on. For now, I would say um, consult some reputable resources and don't just trust maybe individual vendors that unfortunately oftentimes may just want to sell you some solutions.
Hmm. Is it the reason why you started your research firm, High Value Target? What was the motivation behind it, and what are you trying to achieve via this company?
The goal is not the company, but the goal is the methodology behind. In fact, High Value Target is a methodology which is open for everyone, can be found on the website, and has been socialized with all the possible groups out there. I spoke at the MITRE conferences, United Nations, many others, the financial ISAC sector. And it was created, first of all, because the way how we do business impact analysis is flawed in a way, right? It's great for assessing the most critical processes and business capabilities that are out there, right? That are needed to run during disruption. However, it has not been adapted since a couple of years ago with a directive from NIST. It's the 8286D addendum, which tells you that you need to assess loss scenarios, right? Not only based on the loss of availability, meaning something is not available, like an application or a platform, but you have to expand these loss scenarios to the loss of confidentiality and integrity, which sounds reasonable, like the
Mhm.
CIA Triad. However, it's difficult to apply once again. So we needed something together with a couple of great colleagues I have, like Kalin Georgiou and a few others. We said we need something more applicable, and so we created the methodology, high value target methodology, which helps you to look at all of your set of assets, applications and platforms, and then you can assess with precise questions what actually is going to go wrong once something occurs. And this then helps you define what are these critical assets. And so, just to wrap up, I would say the reason why I set this up was to ensure that we don't overinvest in some capabilities, let them be defensive, protective, and so, but then we ignore the other ones that will have a higher return on the investment, like, for example, some cyber recovery capabilities, which now
Mhm.
many people are going into those, but then they may go into it a bit blindly and they may apply them to the wrong assets.
Mhm.
That is why you need to identify these high value targets and make this a fundamental part of your cyber resilience strategy.
Yeah, and today enterprises have very different structures, and I know it might be a little bit difficult to generalize what would be a high value target for one company versus for another company. But since you spent quite a number of years in the industry, what would you say some of the areas that you think many CISOs are not paying closer attention to and paying too much attention to?
This is a very common pattern among all of the companies. There is already a huge focus, and rightly so, on assets that host a lot of informational value. This can
Mhm.
be business databases, ERP systems, a lot of um, uh, assets that store secrets, Active Directory,
Mhm.
PKI, and many others. So this is clear. Everyone does it this way. In fact, the concept of critical asset is often named as well crown jewels, which
Yeah.
signifies the importance of these. What instead is not done appropriately, and as a result, we see many breaches happening because of this, are the undervalued assets, or maybe those pieces of technology that the adversaries know very well that they are actually legitimate tools, but they become now part of the attack surface. And it doesn't mean only those that are exposed to the internet, because again, for those exposed to the internet, we oftentimes do many things. We do additional pen testing, we do many, uh,
Mhm.
attack surface discovery and so on. But the ones inside the company that don't get a lot of airtime, but that exhibit the properties that the adversaries are going after. I'll make you an example. Patching
Mhm.
tools. If you compromise a patching tool nowadays, like look at SCCM for Microsoft or any other patching tool for servers, you can actually compromise most of the organization. Do most companies protect their patching tools in the same way as they protect Active Directory or some of the crown jewels? I'm not so sure.
Mhm.
Another example is software that is commodity software, open source, like 7-Zip, an example. Again, I don't have anything against the company or anything. I'm just saying it's an example of open source tool that most companies have, and they just deploy, right?
Mhm.
So what would happen if those packages are actually compromised? Well, we see it sometimes, right? So it's about this adversarial mindset the voice of the adversary technique that is described in MITRE methodologies, but doesn't get a lot of airtime. And using these techniques into traditional ways of assessing the importance of assets, right?
Mm, mm. So what I'm understanding from what you just explained is all of these tools that still have a lot of access to all their information that um, would be considered as crown jewels, but wouldn't be typically um, identified as critical. Those are typically
I would
under.
say that I would say that the reason why they are critical may differ, and
Mhm,
therefore the way of protecting them will differ as well, right? So,
mhm,
but the key thing is that out of, suppose you have 1,000 applications and assets, right, that you must protect, including the business and technology, and so you typically an anti-pattern of doing well criticality assessment is that you assess everything as critical, or maybe 50%, 30% of what you have is critical. That's not really truly critical, right? I would encourage organizations to look at the maybe the 30%, 20, 30% often is important, I call. So for example, for availability purposes, for disaster recovery, for data availability,
mhm,
that's the 30%. But within the 30%, you must have other buckets. And most often, I would say the 10% of the 30% is going to be the truly criticals. Now, you may have even a subset of these that is the minimum viable. And that's an
mhm,
evolving concept in resilience. I collaborated on a paper for the White House a couple of years back, which was the PCAST report. And there it was clearly explained the minimum viable operations, minimum viable company. What does it mean? That may be an
mhm,
additional 10% of that one that I just described, which is what is the absolute minimum you need to keep the lights on.
mhm, mhm.
So I think it is important for professionals to understand and to have methodologies in place to identify these, because the classification of what's most relevant is just dependent on what you are going to do with it. So
Yeah.
if you don't do anything different for those, or you provide other capabilities, then there's no point in identifying them as critical.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. We should definitely include that paper that you just mentioned after this recording. And
Pleasure.
in your view, how should leaders truly quantify cyber impact to decide what risks to retain and what to mitigate operationally and what truly makes sense to transfer to insurance? Like, what do you think most companies get wrong?
The quantification of the loss is what currently is not really well done in most places.
Mhm,
There is an emerging trend of performing cyber risk quantification, emerging, or maybe it's already history for some of the banks because they already do it. But for organizations outside of the financial sector, cyber risk quantification is something that starts getting adopted, and I'm very happy to see it. There are methodologies like FAIR that are now as well integrated with adversarial threat informed defense methodologies like MITRE ATT&CK, and they help companies to assess um, where some investment can bring down more risk, right?
mhm,
And suppose that these methodologies already operate and are fine, which is at the end the concept of threat informed risk and compliance, not just threat informed defense.
mhm,
Um, what I see as an emerging area, though, is cyber impact quantification and cyber loss quantification. So if I go to a board and I ask, well, what's the threat scenarios that will cause the highest damage and you cannot withstand that damage? What would it be? And these calculations are not super complex, like technically or statistically speaking, but they require many stakeholders to be brought together. You need to start discussing not only technology losses, but stock, supply chain, for example, for pharma companies, um, contingency measures, maybe the cost of outsourcing a part of a process to a third-party vendor or a fourth-party vendor. And then you put all of this together, and oftentimes this helps as well for cyber insurance discussions. So you
mhm,
then want a broker or someone who helps you in coming to these final numbers.
Mm. Yeah, I have my sort of personal curiosity. I know that there is a lot of research about identifying what would be the cost with the external attacks. But when it comes to internal threats, is this something that you see that's being highly developed today? And is it as easy to quantify?
Well, the discovery of attack paths needs to be looked at regardless of the area where the attack path really takes place, right? Because an
Mm,
attack path is such and is part of a threat model for a given application or platform or solution. And so obviously we cannot just protect ourselves against external attack paths or attacks that generate from, for example, a DMZ or so, but the we know that the strongest threat is the one from the inside, so the insider threat. Now, for
mm,
this, we have created methodology which is high value target roles that is as well published on our website. It's free, and it's actually taking insider threat definitions to another level,
mhm,
and it hopefully helps defining all of the roles in the organization that actually, for one reason or another, have properties that the adversaries know very well about, and they will try to exploit these properties in these people in these roles. In quantifying these internal attack paths, that's obviously possible, and a part of our operating model for cyber resilience is to actually, like at least one third of it would be to ensure continuous assurance and validation of your cyber resilience posture, which means red teaming and attack simulations. So if you look mm, at an operating model, you need to have critical asset defense, technology resilience. That's one third. Another third is going to be cyber recovery, data vaulting, and tabletops. And then another third is going to be this internal adversarial team. And this will then help you discover the blast radius. How far will the threat go? And this is ultimately sitting at the core of a well crafted cyber resilience strategy
mm,
because there are three types of risk that we can address today in security and in resilience. One is the likelihood of something occurring where preventative and protective controls already are done and traditional methodologies work. Then you
mhm,
got the likelihood of impact once something has occurred. Here you enter more into the response side of things and maybe some recovery. And the last one, which is the most difficult to address and quantify, is the magnitude of impact. And
mm,
that is at the core of well crafted cyber resilience programs.
mm. It seems like there are so many variables that need to be considered, whoever is literally structuring the whole resilience program from scratch. A lot of things to handle. I wonder, I know that you also been part of pharmaceutical industry for a while now. Um, is there a certain blueprint or structure that you used when it comes to resilience within this industry? Or what did you find to be very different in pharma industry versus any other industry you've been part of when it comes to cyber?
There is not something fundamentally different, but again, I would go back to the CIA Triad because, for example, in the manufacturing space or fast moving consumer goods like regular brands, availability is typically key, right? You must
Mm,
produce and you must sell. The stock, it's filling in very fast, and so you cannot host stock as a safety measure. Uh, in banking and insurance, obviously you have a lot of focus on confidentiality even more than the rest. Obviously, while even keeping the lights on the rest, but confidentiality is the number one. And in pharma and healthcare in general, integrity is often like key. So
mhm,
you cannot if you have the minimal doubt of any threat affecting the integrity of the data you're processing, that's immediately a patient safety red flag.
mm,
Immediately, even if not verified, you would stop any production, right? which would not maybe be immediately the case in other areas, because that may lead to some faulty products, but not a safety concern. So if there's a safety concern immediately, it's a no-go. So that's the main change. Then what I would say is that every organization needs to ensure that they exchange threat intel, but even practice and regular best practice information with other companies. And so that is what's happened very well in the healthcare sector and pharma. There is the Health ISAC, which currently contributing to as well. And we regularly exchange information with other global companies of the same kind.
Yeah. And how did you see typically leaders in pharma industry really going ahead and addressing this, I wouldn't say blind spot, but this additional challenge of protecting information integrity that you just mentioned? What are some of the things that you saw leaders going with?
Definitely segmenting the boundaries. In this case, can be network boundaries or application boundaries, ensuring that we understand very well what connects to what. Dependency mapping is absolutely key in my view, and every company taking resilience seriously should have dependency maps. Um, the other one is, well, integrity monitoring. So obviously having a good strategy for monitoring and threat hunting, but monitoring the integrity of the data is key, especially when there are patents involved or patients' data involved. And then there are practices, right? There is GXP, there is HIPAA, there are other uh, best practices and standards that must be followed. Mm, at the end of the day, though, the standards that apply, so following, I'm a big fan of following best practice and following baselines. So if you follow the enhanced baselines, for example, from the NIST side, then you will never be wrong in applying them to any company's critical assets, right? There will be some controls that will need to be tweaked, but you will do that customized for by company. Once again, these standards are universal, um, and professionals, unfortunately, oftentimes they don't know them well enough. That is why I set up as well an academy and other ways to actually get people to use these standards.
Hmm. And what do you see as bigger challenges? You know, the year 2026 just started, and a lot of threat reports are coming out with the analysis of 2025 and what to expect in 2026. What is your view of some of the threats that we should definitely pay close attention to?
I would refrain from giving advice on this specifically
Mm,
because the threat is so dynamic, and rather I would prefer to comment on what are the things, the fundamentals that people still get wrong. And not everyone, of course, but many organizations still get wrong, and they mm, decline to address because of this new trend. And one
mhm.
of the new trends is obviously AI cybersecurity, which we cannot ignore.
Yeah.
However, what do we do about our legacy assets? What do we do about the technical debt and replacing old technologies? These are weak points and choke points that must be addressed first. Another one is the convergence of IT systems and OT systems. Again, not a fancy trend, but something that most organizations still don't get really right. Um, I I would say that the trend I see definitely is the so-called compound APT. So the advanced persistent threat that is now joining forces with others. And we've seen it in recent incidents in the UK, for example. And the threat you don't have anymore one threat actors coming after you, but then you have others that will collaborate with them, or maybe they will even try to harm one another's objectives. And this creates a lot of chaos. So what you want in resilience is actually you want to deal with the unknown, right? And you want to make you want to increase the predictability of these attack paths. It doesn't mean that you you cannot have any attack paths or exposure, but you must understand it so that, for example, you can direct the adversary there where you want them to go, not there where they want to or they can go. So a trend I would encourage to follow, well, is anything to manage your attack surface in a way that it becomes something where you rather manipulate the adversary to go into and not the other way around. Um, so look at things like, again, some of the basics, having a good deception in place. That's absolutely key nowadays.
Mhm. Yeah, I do want to pinpoint on the thing you just mentioned when it comes to attack surface. Um, Especially today, there are a lot of AI tools and SaaS platforms. We see them migrating to the browser and living on the browser, which obviously encourages a lot of us to actually conduct most of our work there. From resilience perspective, how should organizations think about this massive attack surface that often sits outside traditional security controls?
This is not a new topic for me. I think I've been, sandboxing of browsers is super critical for any user, honestly, because if you think about just leveraging on proxy controls and firewall controls, but instead you have direct access to the internet, um, that's a huge gap. So again, we could do everything well on protecting everything else, and then we get some misconfiguration or the the like the configuration that we have is too much prone to tampering, and then it can open directly an outbound connection to the outside world without you knowing. So I would say that access to, for example, the internet needs to be definitely locked down on most of the critical assets or workstations as well. Need to have privileged access workstations with very well controlled um, privileged access monitoring in place, session recording, all of these good things. And for browsers, having sandboxing in place is critical, and to ensure that we don't allow, for example, something that you see in banking that I love is having access to the internet is a privilege. You don't have 100,000 users able to go to the internet. You just have a super minimal amount of users that need it for the work, and as a result, they will be able to do that. Um, so these are some of the advices I'd have.
And outside of your regular work, you're also heavily involved with the cybersecurity community. Tell us a little more about your community efforts, for example, about the capability maturity model you created.
As with other initiatives, this is a result of collaboration with some great minds out there. Which we got Patrick Lechner, we got Mehdi Azoui from France, and Patrick from Switzerland. We actually sat down and we created this model. The reason was simple: was, well, how can I measure the progress of my cyber resilience maturity? There was nothing available. And we thought, well, we're friends with Rob Vanos from the SOC capability maturity model. Said, well, Rob, what suggestion would you have? And you guys could actually create, a model for measuring maturity in cyber resilience. And that's exactly what we've done. We created a model which starts from the cyber resilience officer at the top, which has the accountability for answering the broader question: what's my cyber resilience posture, and what does it mean, and how do I measure it? And then there are a number of enablers, like things like risk and compliance, business impact analysis, many others, that are things you need to rely on, capabilities of the enterprise and of IT, or even the business, plus then 10 practices that every organization needs to leverage. These are agnostic to the sector, and then based on the 10 practices, we created a number of questions. It's quite a loaded number of questions now, so please don't get scared if you open up the tool. It's 150 plus questions, And then based on these questions, you can assess your maturity level. This will help in which way? It will help you because then based on this current state, you can know which services and which capabilities internally you must have. So if you, for example, it's an issue that I see now, I mean, from a couple of years already, like what does it mean to hire good cyber resilience specialists? What should they do? What services will they deliver internally? And so the capability maturity model explains these services that you need to have based on these capabilities and these enablers. And it's downloadable for free at crcmm.org. Mm, and you can even run an assessment online if you want.
Yeah, this is awesome for someone who, prepared this New Year resolutions of understanding what exactly they have in place, and to actually, as you were mentioning earlier, identifying what are the high value targets for them, going into the new year. You also recently founded the Cyber Resilience Academy. What gap in the industry are you trying to fill, and what do you hope graduates walk away understanding?
So I actually looked back at what it took me and a few others, I'm not unique in this, to get into the field of cyber resilience. And it was a matter of studying very lengthy publications in detail. We reach easily between 1 and 3,000 pages of things that need to be read and studied. There's no AI magic in this, like you just need to go through it. And then one gap that I realized all of a sudden it was, well, in the moment when I needed to expand the team and the organization, I said, well, what are the skills that we need for cyber resilience to come to life in a team? And there was nothing available. So I went back to my NIST contacts, and there was not a competency area available in the frameworks. So that's what I did. I collaborated with NIST and with other some private and public sector companies, and I brought together this task force where we created a new competency area, practically a new profession, right? Um, this will take years to be picked up from industry. I mean, I foresee the first cyber resilience officer roles to, well, there are already some companies that adopt them, surely, like in my case, but and in others, but it will be much more viral. And there you see the skills needed. There's roughly 200 task statements that are part of the job description for a cyber resilience expert, and that need to be learned and then adopted. And at the academy, that's exactly what is being done. So taking all the standards available, converging them into something that is digestible and easy to go through, and then at the end you get like a certified cyber resilience officer badge, which is pretty cool. And yeah, and I will never stop researching and then learning and teaching others as well these things, right? Because that's what, even partially like why we're here for, like to enable others to
Yeah,
to enter in something they like.
yeah, indeed. And I'm sure that while you were creating this academy, creating this program, it also, you took a lot of learnings from how you were hiring people, and you hired hundreds of security professionals throughout your career. What do you believe really separates the candidates who thrive in these resilience-based roles from those who struggle?
This may be a bit surprising, but I would say creativity. Because during disruption, of course, you need to follow plans, of course, you need to have capabilities, but you need various approaches, and you need to have a mind that is um, jumping very fast from one field to another, and without barriers. And some of the best cyber resilience people I know, they are as well pretty creative in the way how to achieve things, thinking about how an attacker would bypass certain areas and so on. And they oftentimes come as well from different fields. So they didn't just spend 10 years in system engineering. They spent some years in offensive, some years in defensive, some in risk and compliance, some in business continuity, crisis management, and these have the X factor.
And what do you think about people that came from completely different direction? I know that I'm going to be speaking with someone who started from marketing. That is quite creative. But what is your thought process about having people from completely different industries?
It's not something that I haven't done. I mean, I have advised people on that were interested in entering cybersecurity for some reason, maybe even personal. And I do have a number of examples. Someone entering from finance, or from even doing a completely different job, like maybe even in the transportation industry. So the key thing, though, I think, is to look at the closest subject matter expert domain that you can hop into, right? Or for
Mhm.
example, if you are a teacher of a completely different subject and you want to enter in cyber, well, then you will start from culture and security awareness, right?
Yeah.
Instead, if you are interested into um, breaking things, then obviously you will start from a white hat hacking, ethical hacking, and so on. But I would suggest definitely to start from the closest hop you have. If you come from marketing, then the first is going to be product marketing, but for a security company, and then you keep going from there. But
Mm.
the one thing I want to stress, though, is there is no discount in my word for professionals that do not spend enough time in studying the standards and the methodologies that are available,
Mm.
because time spent there will always be fruitful,
Yeah.
regardless of where you go sooner or later.
Yeah, this is beautifully said, Francesco. And as we approach closer to the end of our podcast, if you could wave a magic wand and have every CISO implement one capability tomorrow to improve their resilience posture, what would it be?
Obviously, it needs to be something related to resilience, and I would definitely say
Mm.
cyber recovery, isolated recovery, data vaulting, and to do it properly, to do it well. So not just following some buzzword from some of the vendors out there, but really do it, choose the vendor carefully, and then implement something that follows best practice standards and proven methods that work. I see way too much investment in protective and preventive protective technology, and even response. It's all good, but now we know it's not about 1 in 100 or 1 in 10. We know it will happen, and capabilities in this space of cyber recovery are super rudimental in most companies. Or if there are some capabilities, then they most often will not withstand a destructive ransomware event on data, and as a result on all of the recovery infrastructure. So that's
Yeah.
my one bet.
Yeah. And we have this transition, Francesco, where at the end of the podcast, we would ask our previous guest to ask question to the next guest. So our previous guest asked you, what excites you about the future of cybersecurity and what gives you hope? Because there are a lot of bad situations happening in cyber, so you have to be an optimist in this space. So what would it be for you?
There's two things I would say. The first one is new technology that is expanding so rapidly that we can't even imagine how rapidly this is. I speak obviously about anything to do with AI, and it offers, because it's new, it will attract hopefully a lot of new talent, new people interested in the space, maybe even because of various reasons, maybe even monetary. But then I hope they will find some passion in it, and they will dig deeper and help evolve the security of those tools themselves. So it's an exciting moment to be in. And secondly, I would say I've been traveling quite a bit last year. I've been even traveling to some African countries, and I see a lot of talent that has potential to enter in the field. So I would definitely encourage everyone to look at what cybersecurity and cyber resilience has to offer, and I would welcome everyone to join the army of cyber resilience officer, of course. I'd love to train you too as well.
That's awesome. What question would you like to ask to our next guest?
Uh, yeah, so I thought about it and I wrote it down. So my question for the next guest is, which attack, if it happened tomorrow, would push you beyond the ability to restore operations, customer trust, and control over a company's environment? So what is
Yeah.
this like extreme but plausible scenario that maybe you're not prepared for yet, or you see companies not being prepared for?
I already feel bad for our next guest, but
I know.
I'm sure they'll manage. It's a pessimistic world for cyber leaders at times, but these kind of questions really test, as you were mentioning earlier, the creativity of thinking when it comes to responding to so
Yeah.
many attacks.
The question I got was much more positive, I think, compared to this one.
That is very true. Well, Francesco, thank you so much for being part of the Be Fearless podcast. I think we've covered so many interesting areas, and I love how deeper we really went into cyber resilience, because this is definitely the topic that not many people understand the granularity. So it's great to see how big exposure actually is and how much more education in this space is needed. So I really enjoyed the conversation, Francesco. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Likewise. And hi, everyone. Thank you.